everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Fulbright Podcast. Fulbright is an exclusive networking platform for Fulbright alumni and grantees. The platform lets you keep up to date with news from the global community of Fulbrighters and connect with fellow alumni and grantees from around the world. If you are a current grantee or an alumni from an official Fulbright program, head to fulbrighternetwork.com to create your account. My name is Gabriela Jimenez, and I'm a journalist and the community manager for the Fulbright platform. Today, I will have a conversation with Thatcher Warrick Hess, a trilingual multimedia journalist, historian, and linguist from California, who reports on multilingual communities, mainly those that speak Portuguese and Spanish. He obtained a master's in bilingual journalism at the University of Arizona and was an English teaching assistant in Brazil in 2020. Thatcher has also been to 32 countries, mostly interested in language acquisition, language policy, and identity. He started a podcast company in 2021 called the Obscurity Podcast Network, where he attempts to return antique objects back to the families that once owned them. In addition to all of that, he's also directed and filmed over 15 packages, short films, and feature-length documentaries focused on making educational and informative snapshots of history. Apology Times, one of his latest works, focuses on the Japanese community in São Paulo, Brazil. Hi, Thatcher. It is a pleasure to have you on our podcast. And am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. It's a pleasure. Well, first of all, I would love to hear a little bit about your time as an English teaching assistant in Brazil. How did you first hear about the program?
Yeah, so for that, since it was kind of right out of the pandemic, I actually applied, I think at the end of 2019 when I was finishing up my undergrad. And right when I graduated in the winter of 2019, I started to realize, okay, I have to kind of be an adult. I have to start to do things. And then COVID happened. But yet I had already applied for the Fulbright ETA. And so it was actually about 2.5 years of waiting where we were about 30 of us were accepted into the program. And over those 2-3 years, a lot of people had to drop out or couldn't do it anymore by 2022. And so by April of 2022, we were all ready to go. But yet it was this idea that I had signed up for something that I didn't really know how to do. I never had any experience with teaching. And then, of course, teaching a language, even though it's my native language, English, I was really focused on phonetics and phonology of Spanish and Portuguese. And so that I think was still helpful when I actually got there and I started to realize that I could teach and that it wasn't as hard as I was expecting. I realized that it was not my full passion. And so Fulbright did kind of two things. That having us do the side project, which we had to spend 10 hours a week on while we were also teaching at the universities, I started to realize I really wanted to focus on the side project sometimes more than the conversation clubs. And this was on San Luis do Maranhão, right, at UFMA. And so having it kind of in that area where very few of the population speaks English. Out of our 9 months there, me and my co-ETA, we saw one American. And so being there for that long and not having really any exposure forced us to kind of learn Portuguese. But then I was like, what do I want to do with that? Do I want to continue to teach English, or do I actually want to do the side project, which I decided to continue the podcast Object Obscura. So I continued that for my third season in Brazil while I was teaching. And so long story short, when I realized that I came back and I saw this bilingual journalism program, which was quite new at the University of Arizona, I realized, wait a second, that's what I was doing. I was already doing journalism. And that is the side of the Fulbright that I actually put a little bit more energy and weight and passion towards. And so I think that's where I kind of was like, okay, let me try this bilingual journalism career and maybe put teaching and kind of the pedagogy of English and or just any other language to the side.
So I understand your award helped you also understand what you wanted for your future career, which is, great. It's a great outcome, I think. I was just wondering, perhaps it was this experience, but you can tell me if that's not the case. How did you first become interested in languages? Because, prior to going to Brazil, you had already studied phonetics and things like that, as you said. So when did that interest first come about? And then maybe you can tell us as well why Portuguese and Spanish were the languages that you ended up focusing on, if it was because of the Fulbright or something else.
Yeah, it's one of those biggest questions where I I've always been interested in language, and to like pinpoint a certain moment, I do think it was I grew up on the coast of California in Santa Cruz, like a very surfer kind of chill town. And there I had a babysitter who was from Mexico. And she would talk on the phone. She was like 17 or 18 at the time. And we were like, 2 and 5, my sister. And so I remember hearing her speak to her boyfriend in Spanish and kind of thinking, "Oh, that's fascinating. She can communicate to somebody and I'm not receiving the same communication, but I still want to know what is she saying? What are the symbols and sounds of that are coming out of her mouth?" And so it was like, about years and years of that listening. And there's an audio that like a video that my family has captured of me running around the house and saying carro, carro, and rolling my R's because I was listening to my babysitter. And no one else in my family could do that, right? So it was really interesting that I was just so interested in how to not like emulate or mock anyone's dialect speech, but more just being so fascinated that I didn't really know what line was kind of rude or what wasn't. So it started to kind of blossom where I would go out to supermarkets, like with my mom, would go shopping, like with family or whatever. And I would hear other people with different accents, sometimes speaking English. And sometimes I would not knowingly, it was, and now thinking about it, it's pretty rude, but I would just kind of like imitate what they were sounding like out loud because I was so interested in what are those sounds? Why haven't I heard those before? Why is my speech different? And so I would imitate those. And of course, it would be kind of like, Thatcher, don't do that. Or like the family's right there. That's that's insensitive, right? So I had to kind of condition myself, okay, I realized that I like to when someone's talking, I'm not listening what they're saying. I'm listening to how they're saying it, right? So over time, that started to be the crux of just every just meeting people like classmates or different families from all over the world. And so far, I've been to like 29, 30 countries, and yet every single time, I'm always pushing myself to learn a new word in that language from someone who's native in that language. And to me, that's like the biggest growth. And so, yeah, my journey to become a linguist has been kind of circuitous, but I think it's been a journey that I've really understood now more of the ethics of how to actually respect speech communities across the world.
So you've mentioned you traveled quite a lot researching multilingual communities, right? What were some of your findings during those trips? Is there any particular place that struck you as, very interesting? I'm not sure if you're researching communities where people also speak different languages or if you're just looking for different, dialects or accents or so can you tell us a little bit about that, exploring that you've done of multilingual communities?
Yeah, I think the biggest kind of opening for that was going to Brazil for the first time because it's one of the very few countries I feel like that one person could go maybe 2 hours from their city where they live into the same state and start talking to somebody in Portuguese, and they would have sometimes have no idea what they're saying. To me, that was really beautiful. That, like for Maranhão, for example, we went into Bacabal, which is a very small town, about no, maybe 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours from San Luis. And there, I think someone in our program was using a word that we had learned in San Luis, in the capital of the state. that in Bacabal, they're like, oh no, we don't say that. And I just thought that was so interesting that if I were then to go maybe another 3 hours south and more into maybe Tocantins or Balsas or just another city in Maranhão, what other words would they not use that San Luis does? And so I think just with the Portuguese variation of Brazilian Portuguese specifically, that really sparked an interest in thinking, wow, this seems to be almost 10 times more variationist, I guess you could say, than the United States, where similarly things happen where one city in a state, there's probably some words here in Tucson, Arizona, that in Flagstaff may not be very common, and vice versa. That might be more about geography and actual migration patterns of people coming down. We have a term here called snowbirds. It's pretty much this idea about all the people from the north part of the country that come down for the winter, because this is a very warm winter, right? Comparatively, and they come down to this part of the United States. And so it's funny that Tucson has this term because we know a lot of people come and kind of help with tourism during the wintertime because it's one of the warmer in the country. So just things like that affects variation all over the world. And so I think going to Japan and talking to Japanese Brazilians that live there, some of them being kind of discriminated against because of their accent or because they don't speak quote unquote perfect Japanese, and then also vice versa in Brazil, seeing there were some communities that still spoke Japanese and did not want to learn Portuguese, right? And I think all of that is really interesting because I'm trying to understand what is the human condition. Like language is the one thing that bridges us all together, and yet it's kind of like the least, in my opinion, the least reported thing for journalism's sake. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer to say that's why I really wanted to create this field called journal linguistics, which essentially would kind of bridge that gap and not only wanting to speak and interview somebody in their language, but about their language. What is the identity? How do they feel when they talk? And so traveling the world has, even if it's most of the time just kind of for pleasure, I've always wanted to kind of tap into that. Like, why do you use that word? How do you feel when you use it? And what are kind of some of the pressures that you're feeling from either your government or even just like a familial pressure? They don't want you to use this word, or you are forced to learn a specific type or dialect of language. So all of that, I think, is the kind of the crux of my research. But now, since I'm a journalist, I have to kind of shift it a little bit and not just focus on kind of the research. It's now, how do I distribute this message and these findings to the masses? And that's kind of where I'm at right now in my career.
I think it's clear to me from what you're explaining that you're a very curious person. And I think, that kind of connects with your other project, because I was listening to some episodes of Object Obscura, your podcast, and I was really struck by the theme. It's a very, very creative way to approach, I think, history, for instance, and memory. So I wanted to understand what made you want to start a podcast and how did the theme come about? And, the theme for those who are listening to us is returning antiques to the family that once owned them. So basically, you pick up an object and then you kind of try to find out the history of that object and really trace it back to whoever owned it, right? So I thought that was quite interesting. So tell us a little bit about that project. How did it start? Why a podcast, and why this theme that is very unique, I think, very particular way to discuss history and memory?
Yeah, it was kind of one of those pandemic passion projects. So at the end of 2020, um, where I really was thinking the world might end. What is the last thing that I could do that it would at least fill me with a bit of joy right before the apocalypse could happen? I was a bit pessimistic at the time. And so in 2020, I was talking with my family. My sister actually came up with the name Object Obscura. And because obscura, we see this in Latin, like for camera obscura, all this. There's also another podcast and book called Atlas Obscura, where they focus on different places in the world that are really unique and strange. So I was really thinking about kind of that business model, what they've done with Atlas Obscura. I thought, well, why not about objects? What about the objects that we just don't know about? And then, of course, I thought, well, I collect antiques and I have been my whole life. Why don't I just do the objects that are on my shelf that I don't really know where they belong? So that was kind of the biggest start, where I just got kind of a bucket, started to put objects in that I thought could go somewhere, right? And then I would spend about a year in production of finding where each of these objects led to. So as in like notes that were left in, I would go to ancestry.com and just hours and hours trying to match the signature or trying to piece together certain parts of the story until I found the actual family. And then what would happen is that after talking to an expert, realizing what the object was, I would then talk to the family and ask them, do you want the object back? What do you want from this object? Because I want to hear your story and your family's story. And generally, kind of the shocking thing is a lot of them would say, we remember this object, we know who it belongs to, but honestly, we don't need it back. You can have it. So that happened a lot, and I still have a lot of these family's objects where I have like almost an audio archive of their story that's there forever on Apple Podcasts. And so to me, that was just a really beautiful thing. And honestly, I woke up every morning because I was so curious to see where something led. And that was kind of the catch-22 of this, right? Is that I could find an object that could lead to a really bad person. And that is kind of a hard thing. You don't know what family you're going to, what person you're actually going to find. And so that's a really difficult thing that I wanted to keep it as truthful and factual as possible, but also honest. And if they were like, yeah, he wasn't great, or he did kind of some weird things, I would have to show that, but also realize that I can't make it salacious or just about shock value. This is history in people's lives we're dealing with. So I think that was a great way to get into journalism, but that was my very first journalism job, was my own company, doing what I wanted, and doing 3.5 to 4 seasons of that was amazing. And I think that also got me partly into the job at AZPM, being a journalist, is having that kind of repertoire to do very intense audio, scripts, recording it for some of those episodes that are 50 minutes, some of them 20 to 50 minutes. I would spend about 20 to 30 hours editing, just the editing process at the very end. And that's not plus 10 hours of research and whatnot over time. So it definitely took a lot of time, especially for season 2, where we had 10 episodes and each episode's a different object. I mean, that took a whole year to essentially plan out. Here's the expert for this object, for this particular field, and then here is the person where we lead to. And I had to map that all out and really try to get as creative as possible, but to also be as factual as possible. And I did have to stop Object Obscura a little bit when I did my bilingual journalism degree. I did some of the episodes for class projects, so I could turn that in and feel kind of like my business was helping my school career. But it's definitely been quite difficult to do it as a full-time multimedia journalist. Next semester, so in the spring of 2026, I'm actually working with 2 professors at the history program at the University of Arizona, and we're thinking about doing a project that's pretty much doing this, is archiving audio histories about objects that people bring in that live in Tucson, that are kind of more related to the Southwest part of the United States. And so that kind of fuel, that fire, is still continuing, and I'm so happy that I have the opportunity to do that next year.
And just out of curiosity, you said, you would pick some objects that you thought would lead somewhere. How did you choose the objects? Like, what was the thing that made you say, okay, I feel like this can go somewhere? Is there like some frameworks that you were looking at?
Yeah, it's kind of the difficult thing of do I just find an object that has a signature or written name on it? That's the biggest thing, is finding markings about possession. Who would want an object to go, this is mine, right? And write their name. That's generally where it starts. But sometimes it's just the strangeness of the object. One of them I did on an ice spear fishing decoy. So it's a wood carved thing about this big, and it looks like a fish. But this one was quite old, from probably like the 40s or 50s. And so in the north of the United States or in Canada, they would like cut a hole. They would put their fishing line in with this like decoy, and then it would kind of move in the water and attract fish. So that episode is really strange because the only tag on it that was original was the person who sold it about 40 years ago, not the person who made it. And so that was a difficult episode where I really wanted to find who was that original artist. And so I found the collector's family, but they didn't know this particular artist. And so I had to contact people, at that time too, I sent a lot of mail, actually in the actual mail, like postage to people, because it felt a little bit more personal. That during COVID, it was like kind of the one things I felt like that kind of bridged the gap. So if there was anyone that were my stories, the objects would leave me that I wouldn't expect, I would send them a letter and have it signed on the bottom. And that I think actually helped. So for a lot of these stories, I did not think it would go anywhere. And I did not think I would find anyone. Sending that letter, even though it may take a month for them to get back, really actually did help. And I think it made my job more fun, because I think I started to, by season 3, pick objects that I felt like I knew were going to go somewhere no matter what. And even in Brazil, I did one on a book at a sebo, right? You know, just go in, find an old book. And then this book was really strange that it had really interesting markings on the front. And so the first one was in Portuguese, but was written in a way that just did not feel like it was someone who was Brazilian, because some of it was in English. Then we saw a stamp that actually said that it was from a library from like a Cabo Submarino, like one of those old telegraph stations. I thought, oh, okay, where could this go? And that's one of my actually most research intensive episodes that I've done. And so I think that to me is really the main goal. It's just finding something that, even though if I don't find the person, I can still make it as interesting as possible. And that's kind of the fun of doing, I would say, historical investigative journalism like that, where you can kind of bend the rules a little bit, even if your outcome is not what you expected.
And I know you've mentioned some already, but do you have a favorite story? Like, do you have one that you're like, oh, that was like the most interesting one that I've seen, or one that stands out to you? Because I know you've done 3 seasons, so there's roughly 50, 60 episodes or something like that, right? If I'm not. So which one, I think, stood out to you?
I think it was the last episode of season 2 where I bought a film tin, so it's about this big, like a dinner plate size, in Texas. And I bought it because when I like shook it around, I could see that there was something inside, or I could hear, but I couldn't. It was like rusted shut. I could not open it when I was there at the store. So I just kind of, asked the guy. I said, "There's something inside of it. I don't know what it is. $35, sure." And so there was a point where I came back home and I recorded myself, and I was like, no matter what is in this, I will make an episode on. So I opened it up, and it's a film reel, right, for a movie inside. And I said, okay, this is kind of what I expected. And then I started to look in the film and see what it was. And it was a film that was from 1993 in India. So it was actually a pre-Bollywood film. And I thought, oh, let's go. Let's do this. And so I talked to a film preservationist in New York. I also talked to a cultural anthropologist who studies film industry in India, whose actual family is from India, and she lived in Texas as well. And then I spoke to the director of the movie. So I actually wrote to people responsible, and he responded. I mean, it was a crazy story, because we actually focus, and it's one of the longer episodes, but we focus on an actor who was in this movie, who right after this went to prison and was actually in prison, I think, the most amount of times out of any actor in India. And his kind of persecution from the government there was really interesting. And so the film is maybe not as the main focus, but the whole plot of the movie itself that's in the film canister was kind of playing the life of the main villain in the film, played by this actor. So that to me just kept unraveling and unraveling and unraveling. And then I also realized too, what was in the film tin was actually the trailer of the movie. And the film preservationist I saw, and he's like, oh yeah, if the movie's about 2.5 hours, that would be about 12,000 feet of a film reel. What you have in your canister is maybe 250 to 300 feet, which is about the size, right, of a trailer, of a 3-minute trailer. So just learning all of that, I think, I had no idea where it was going to go. No idea the director would be like, sure. And so I had to call him super late at night. He was in India, so the time difference was interesting. But the most fascinating part was just when I asked him, so like, why did you want to do this movie? What do you think of it? Like looking back, and he's like, I don't think of it. It happened. It's in the past, and that's the movie. And like that was a really interesting perspective. I just was not expecting. So it was not only, where did the object lead me? It's like the perspectives of the people that were really just, I think, interested in talking about their craft and what they wanted to do, but not necessarily about the movie. Because like, especially with Indian cinema, there's a lot of films that are released in such a manner that there's like an abundance of films to look at in 1 year. So this one movie, a lot of the people are like, this is so random. Why this? And it wasn't very successful, but that doesn't matter. I think the biggest thing is people always wanted Object Obscura to be about the unique items, right? Or the things that like you never would imagine someone could talk about. But then I had to shift and actually realize, no, I actually think it's about the items that are ubiquitous that we use all the time from unique perspectives. So I think the object can be anything, but it's like, are the people going to give us the unique take on a thought that maybe you would never think about for this object? So that's why we've done simple things like a phrase book from World War II, or even like a top hat. So it's simple, more or less simple, kind of utilitarian items or items used every day, but yet the takes on these items, I think, were what made them interesting.
And so while researching for your podcast, I mean, you just mentioned, you were surprised the director didn't really care much about the film itself, didn't think about it. And, I was wondering, what have you come to find out about the relationship between objects and memory while working on this project? Have you got any insights or, any thoughts that you didn't have before working on this about how people, kind of connect objects and memory, how they go together at times?
I think material culture is intrinsically linked to human life. Even if someone is minimalist, the minimal amount of objects they have and they call their own represents who they are. So material culture, I think, has shaped our way of being. One of the things in Object Obscura I wanted to do was to look in that way of being. How is that shaped? And especially too for objects that someone used or that they called their own, how did that affect the generations afterwards? I even have one object here. This was not planned, but I actually have it next to me, where this was it's a certificate from 1913, and it's for a farriers association. So this I did for season 2. So it's an association for horseshoe makers called farriers, right? And so I could see on this document that there were little fields that were filled in with someone's signature, right? But it was so faded because it's about 115 years old, 110 years old. And so that was an example where I really had to think, okay, even if I don't find the person, what's the story of how it got to me and its kind of longevity to now? And I found out that the person who had held on to it for about 15 years and who was given to it was actually two local people, and one of them was a farrier himself. So a farrier takes another farrier's items and then puts it on his wall. I was thinking, that's so interesting. So I ended up, befriending this person, and her husband, who was the farrier, did pass away. But it was a really great opportunity to talk about the craft of what being a farrier is. What do you do to have to get around a horse, shave its hoof, and then actually fasten the horseshoe to fit on and make the horse essentially not be in pain. That was all really fascinating. And so I think that was a beautiful opportunity that was not their certificate. And yet they also didn't really know much about the history about the certificate. Where did it come from? How old was it? Someone in that person's family just gave it to them because they were downsizing and had to get rid of some objects. And so that to me was really fascinating, that we learned about, and I actually did find the great-granddaughter also of the man who signed the certificate. And so he lived in Wisconsin, I believe, and that's where this was signed. And then we also have a picture of him that I did somewhere else, but a picture of the man who signed this next to an anvil, and there's all these horseshoes on the ground. I mean, it's just such a beautiful story. And that's one of the very few stories I focused on in Tucson. That's very Tucson centered. Because there's a lot of farriers that still live here in Tucson, or different schools about equestrian horseback riding and stuff like that. So it's really kind of entrenched into Tucson culture. So I just think that was a really fascinating story that showed me that material culture is way more than just having an expensive or having a unique object. It's the people. People make objects exciting, and yet objects make people interesting. And that reciprocity is the crux of Object Obscura.
I think it's really fascinating to think about, all the ways that where the story leads, right? So like you said, it's not necessarily about that object, but I feel like it's about also the journey that it takes you on, right? And the people it leads you to. That brings me to my next question, because your latest documentary, which I understand was a project from your master's at the University of Arizona, it talks about the Japanese community in São Paulo, Brazil. So Brazil has a really large Japanese community, mostly in the city of São Paulo. And your documentary centers on the Brazilian government's past apologies for discrimination against this community. I would love if you could expand a little bit on that project and how you came up with the idea for it as well.
Absolutely. First broached the project in January of 2024, where I definitely wanted to focus on Portuguese speaking diaspora, Lusophone, anything for my final project. My original idea was to actually go to Timor-Leste and focus on the Portuguese spoken there, which is only about 10% of the population of that country. And then I thought, okay, that's too remote. That might be too difficult. Let me try something, but still maybe go into Asia and really focus on Nikkei or Nipo Brasileiros, right? Only focus on a community that most people don't focus on or talk about. So I really honed in on that in January of 2024. I did a lot of research on Japanese Brazilian media, or even just media that was in Japan about Brazilians, or media that was in Brazil about Japanese, or those with ancestry of Brazil or Japan. And I found so much history and a lot of great connections. I was awarded the Tinker Field Grant to conduct research, and I decided to do a documentary. And so in the summer of 2024, I went to Sao Paulo for about 49 days, I believe, and with mostly my phone and some equipment I had to rent. I interviewed 9 people and got a lot of great visuals and just a great vibe of like, this is what Brazil is like. But yet I really actually had no idea where my film was going to go. I had so many different ideas. I think the one thing is I realized when I got to Sao Paulo, I thought that the last Japanese print newspaper had actually folded and it was gone and had disbanded. But when I got there, at some of the newsstands, there were still Japanese newspapers that were current. I thought, wait a second, I thought these were gone. It was called Diário Brasil Nipo was the name of the newspaper. And I thought, oh, interesting. Okay. And then as I kept going to Bunkyo in Liberdade, I realized that the newsroom of the newspaper was in Bunkyo, was in the building, just about 2 floors down from the museum, the historic Japanese Brazilian Immigration Museum. So that was really fascinating. I started to get in there, talk to people about the newspaper, and then I thought, okay, I think this is a way to get into this community is to really focus in who is still reading Japanese in Brazil, right? And then I started to realize, wait a second, there's 220 or so Brazilians of Japanese ancestry living in Japan. Why don't I also focus on Portuguese media in Japan? And then I started to realize, okay, there's actually one magazine called Alternativa in Japan that's all in Portuguese. I was like, okay, let me focus on that. And I was like, all right, let me balance these. So right after Brazil, I went to Japan for about 13 days, filmed there. And thankfully, I had a tour guide who was born in Sao Paulo, now lives in Japan. And so with her, I only spoke Portuguese, and that was wonderful. But yet, that's all I would do in Japan. Whenever someone would speak to me, I would just resort to Portuguese and not even do English or even try Japanese. Which was kind of the sad thing, because while I was actually in Sao Paulo, I took Japanese courses. I took about 2 months of an online Japanese course, but I had to learn Japanese in Portuguese. So that was actually a really difficult challenge. But that was all to prepare me for going to Japan. But while all that was happening, I saw on Instagram, I believe, that one of the days I was actually filming the CEO, the president of Alternativa in Tokyo, in Brasilia, the official apology was happening, and I did not know about it. I knew I maybe saw one video, but I had no idea that it would be as important as it was, and also that it would be reported in both of those media, right? In the Japanese newspaper for the months in a couple of weeks, and in Alternativa magazine in Japan. And so when I started to realize, okay, that's actually the nucleus of the story. What does it mean to apologize? Why do apologies happen? Is it just a performance, or is it actual reparations are being done, or are laws going to change to help a community? And then I was like, well, wait, why don't I focus on the linguistic discrimination of Japanese Brazilians after the war? And that is what I found. My research came out when I talked to everyone. I think I had 12 interviews total of the two countries. The Brazilians of Japanese ancestry would talk about how their parents would not speak Japanese, but that their grandparents did. So I thought, okay, let's look at the generations. Why is one generation speaking it, and then seemingly right around the 1950s or 60s, it's stigmatized in a way that people don't want to continue to speak it to their kids. But yet, during that same time, the Japanese newspapers in Brazil were still being printed. It was only banned by Getúlio Vargas for about 6 years, from 1942 to 1946, 4 to 6 years, where no print media in Japanese could be printed. And then some of the newspapers started to come back. So it's really interesting to me that the media in Japanese was actually increasing by the 1950s, when the speakers and the generational exchange of Japanese was decreasing. And that is the crux of why most third or fourth, and it's true that actually Japanese Brazilians go back 6 generations, can go back in Brazil. And I spoke to a guy who showed me his family tree, and he was like, look, 6 generations. Just, you can't imagine that. It's a history that's way more deeper than most people think. And so I think hearing that and coming out with those conclusions is what I thought, okay, that is where the film is going to take place. And that's the nucleus of it. Let's focus on the apology. That's why I called it Apology Times. When is the time to apologize? And how is that going to affect when it's put into media in the minority language? what is that going to do to that linguist community? And so that's what I did. And I spent a lot of time editing with my co-editor, and I got a team of people in post-production to really help me make this film come true. And now it has, and it's one of the best experiences that I've ever been a part of, to make a feature-length documentary. It's one of my goals. That's definitely fueled me to go back and make more film.
And how can people watch it? Is it available somewhere? Will it be available if anybody who's listening to us wants to see it? What should they do?
Yeah, I think we still have some issues with some of the archival rights, stuff from museums or just other archival videos from certain organizations, that we could only show our film once for a educational purpose. And so I did, for when I got my degree, I actually did have a screening. 90 people showed up from all over the university. I mean, it was an amazing opportunity, and that was really great. So I do have a link that I can share. Despite that, I still want to make sure that it's available for people to see. So I do have it on my website, which I can send to you, and that's apologytimesfilm.com. And then if you go to the tab of film and trailers.
Okay, so we'll make sure to add your website to the description of this episode, and then everybody can go and check it out. So I really enjoyed that conversation. I think you have really interesting projects that you work on. You have so many different interests, journalism, language, podcasting, filmmaking. How do you tackle all of these projects, your different projects that you're working on? Do you have any tips for people for multitasking?
That's a good question. I think from a very young age, when I was 14, I actually created a bucket list of things that I wanted to do before I died. In that bucket list are a lot of the things I've already completed. Some of them are new. One of them, I think, is something like, be featured in a newspaper. And now I'm kind of like the person behind doing that. I write web stories for AZPM here in Tucson. And I think that has really made me think, like, I've come so far. But yeah, if you love to do different things, then do different things. Nothing is more scary than being forced or kind of only focused on one thing in your life that has no variety, that has no nuance. I'm also a collage artist. So with mixed media paper, I make artwork. I'm an illustrator as well. I also make crossword puzzles. And I continue to really push myself to just do things that may not be seen as something that's common. I also am a huge collector of antiques, but also of just different things, like different kind of a niche things. I also am a movie critic. So of course, because I make films, I love to watch movies. So every year I make a list of my favorite films, movies, books, everything. And I kind of do a top 10 list. To me, that's also very important. So yes, I'm a man of many, many things, but sometimes it is the kind of the beauty of realizing all that you've done and then going back to it, right? Like thinking about in the future, there are so many other documentaries I want to make. Some about Japanese Brazilians, some about language in other countries I haven't even been to. And going back to that skill is what kind of keeps me going. And then at that time, when I'm doing that film, I'll think about the things that I'm not doing then and go, oh, I want to go back to collage. And so like having all of these different things, I get to go back to them, and it does fill me with that passion for that time of my life. And I am very privileged to have been to so many places, spoken to so many different people, and had these opportunities that honestly make me happy to be a journalist in 2025.
Well, I think that's great advice. A lot of the times I think we're taught to focus and over specialize in a certain area, but I think there's definitely so many different things that we can do and learn, in this lifetime. So thank you for that. We're sadly coming to the end of our interview. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we go?
Keep making things that you want to. I mean, anyone who's listening who might feel a bit stuck, keep going with that feeling. If you're stuck, you can really focus on things that you may not feel like will get you out of a rut, but I think over time, it really does help to continue to have consistency in something that just fills you with passion. And if I did not do Object Obscura, I would not be here talking with you right now. So I think it's really made me think, just keep going with the things that might seem a bit like, oh, I'm not getting any money from this, or this isn't really helping my career. It actually did. And I'm glad I stuck with it for as long as I did. And I'm here to talk to wonderful people that are willing to share their life with me.
That's really great advice. Thank you so much, Thatcher, for this conversation. It was really interesting. And thank you for all of our listeners as well. We will see you next time on the Fulbrighter podcast. Bye bye.